As a semi-new player looking into the ecosystem of old-school RuneScape, the vocal backlash against the addition of this game's first new skill, Sailing, is somewhat perplexing, especially considering skills are the lifeblood of RuneScape and always have been. They are one of the three core pillars that make the game what it is. Therefore, adding a new one has been a constant since all the way back in RuneScape Classic and RuneScape 2 and of course RuneScape 3. It was only in old school where something like this is seen as taboo, too much of a risk. And I've heard the reasons, from it not feeling like a skill to it being akin to the evolution of combat. There are plenty of valid criticisms for its alpha and beta tests, and there are equally many things left to fix and flesh out. However, the latter point, it being a risk akin to the evolution of combat, is more interesting to me because I already have a video on the former. The shadow of EOC has hung over the body of old school RuneScape for its entire lifespan. This cataclysmic update that eventually birthed OSRS is the bludgeon used against the game-changing ideas. If we stray too far away from whatever we mutually understand old school RuneScape to be, then we will wind up back in 2012, wondering where our favorite game has gone and desperate for it to be brought back. While I can point to the fact that OSRS has been out for longer than it hasn't, that none of the developers who made EOC are working on it, and that nothing within the last 10 years of updates has even remotely resembled anything of the sort, what's more fascinating is that Jagex and its voting player base took a far greater risk 9 years ago. One that never had a standard, a precedent to build off of, a completely new idea that, even stranger, kind of failed. Kourend, also known as Zeah, it's confusing and we'll get to that. This was the first continent to ever be added to RuneScape, not just old school, RuneScape as an IP. Before this, new areas were attached to the main, nameless landmass that makes up Gielinor. However, after passing a poll, Kourend was slowly and painfully brought to life, and it was a total disaster. What ended up releasing was a pale shadow of what could have been, in no small part because the development team themselves was very small. They bit off far more than they could chew. Before then, they had whittled away at minor content updates, Nightmare Zone Zulrah, some UI and compatibility changes. Interestingly, this was somewhat due to the team only recently gaining access to proper development tools, sculpting tools, the ability to create new assets rather than piecing together old ones or repurposing them. If you ever wonder why the Nightmare Zone looks like it does, well, now you don't have to. It's only natural to be excited by this. Now you have the god hand needed to build something great, and as the idiom goes, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. But before we get into how, I want to address terminology. Originally, this continent was called Zeah and housed the enormous city of Great Kourend. This created some bizarre issues, such as the other landmass, the main one, not actually having a name. It was never named. It's not referred to as anything, and due to this, having another one be named is confusing and complicates things unintentionally. Retroactively, Jagex fixed this by ditching the concept of Zeah and instead sticking to regional names, matching the standard of the mainland. Kourend defines a portion of this now denamed landmass, initially Great Kourend and eventually including the Kebos lowlands. For simplicity's sake, I will be calling this topmost region Kourend because, give me a break, but what happened to Kourend, now that's the meat of the story. Thank you for watching. If you're enjoying this video, don't hesitate to like and subscribe. I want to personally thank the members of this channel for helping support my analysis journey. If you're interested in becoming a member like these fine people on screen, you can do so in the description below. You'll receive all kinds of benefits, such as shoutouts in each video and even access to unscripted, members-only content. Thanks again, and back to the video. Retrospectively, it is likely the single most unique event in old-school RuneScape, but at the time was a bit of a catastrophe. This new landmass launched and kind of just sat there. It was clearly underdeveloped and shockingly far too large. An issue that was quickly noted by players was that everything was very big in a disarming way, big and empty. Look at this screenshot. It looks like OSRS, but it also doesn't. It looks like one of those RuneScape private servers that you sometimes get recommended by a YouTube video where the guy is wearing like pink Bandos armor and his whip has flames buffeting out of it. Something is really off, and to figure out what, I went to the original world and tried to find anywhere that looked like this. I mean, this area kind of looks like Glariel's tomb, but no, look how dense the mainland environment is. It's a location made to be walked through and occasionally, if run energy is available, ran through. Meanwhile, this looks like a place to fly over, not a place to walk over, and that might be due to these newly acquired development tools having the ability to span the entire environment in a split second. It isn't unlikely that through working on this project, the developers simply spent so much time in the dev kit that they never noticed this quirk, this issue of scale. And for such a small team that was already spread incredibly thin, working on a shoestring budget and even less time, that might be understandable. To my knowledge, Jagex agreed that it is a problem, one that came about supposedly because the developer who mapped the landscape out on paper scaled things disproportionately and when implemented into the game, made things look empty and too far apart. Maybe this wouldn't have been as problematic if the landscape was filled out, but it wasn't. The content was few and far between, separated by stretches of nothingness and backlit by empty, dark spaces. It's such a strange, surreal experience to fly through Kourend as it once was. For those who don't remember or didn't play at the time, like me, the content Kourend launched with was the favor system, one new quest, 5-ish activities, and that's it. The region was around 1/4 the size of the original game, and that was all that it released with. Let's break down what these individual things were for better context. The favor system saw you do menial labor within one of 5 houses in Kourend. Incrementally, you'd unlock a different reward based on how much favor you accrue, which on its surface sounds pretty neat. 25% may unlock an activity, 50% an item, and so on. The issue came from the activities that provided favor being incredibly dull, and the fact that you lost favor with other houses that weren't the one you were currently gaining favor with. A confounding, frustrating decision that required players to regrind favor time and time again to use many of the utilities in this new area. Losing favor was shortly removed. In fact, in 2024, far later, an unprecedented event happened, likely because this update didn't release pre-2007. The entire system was removed, period, and all of the activities became doable as soon as you discover them in the game world. But what were these initial activities anyway? Well, in Shazian, you could tackle organized crime by visiting a location every hour or so and fighting some low-level mobs. In Lovakeng, you could do blast mining, a totally irrelevant form of training until somewhat recently when the experience rates were buffed. In Arceus, you could give books to wizards, and also Blood and Soul Runecraft, while monotonous, still very relevant today. In Hosidius, you could do the Tithe Farm, an activity that was truly terrible on release, but over years saw many changes and eventually became more palatable. And in Port Piscarilius, you could do stealing artifacts, granting tons of thieving experience. This obviously was not ideal, made worse by the fact that none of these things, barring Runecraft, were polled. Crazy, right? Thanks to engaged members of the community such as Gentle Tractor, who became partly responsible with instilling a new vision and structure to Kourend and eventually Varlamore, Jagex employed a 3-phase release plan to introduce more content into Kourend while reshaping the landscape to look less square. The situation was dire. This was a rather heavy blow to credibility, to trust. The game had just begun to see its first wave of growth after its initial release in 2013. This release, as many know, was followed by a huge decline in players because of a lack of content updates. The small dev team at the time had no access to proper tools to create content, yet still managed to stitch together something, anything that would draw attention. And it did, however minor. Eventually, when they were able to make their own assets, updates like Zulrah began to reshape the landscape of PvM, and updates like Kourend challenged the very nature of what old-school RuneScape can be. The world of 2007 is no longer alone. Coming just 3 years off the heels of the evolution of combat, and then being delivered something as skeletal and strange as Kourend would reinstill a level of insecurity in the game's future, because while it was finally seeing growth, that came at the risk of long-term success. Because RuneScape has always been defined by its persistence. It doesn't ebb and flow in popularity as sporadically as theme park seasonal MMOs. I see this 3-phase rollout as having been retooled after launch. I imagine there being a lot of difficult conversations at Jagex HQ and a lot of needed pep talks to not hesitate with innovating in the face of failure. This is how this tiny development team began to do something remarkable. I think this is the first time in the history of old school RuneScape that we saw the kind of synergy needed between players and developers, curators, and creators in paving a better path for longevity. A great team isn't just one that can push out a piece of content on time, it's one that learns from mistakes and iterates on successes. That is part of what I discussed in my prior video regarding Blizzard's current inability to do just that. It is paramount that those who work on a project understand the project, and while this team may have bitten off more than they could chew, fixing Kourend wasn't something that they took lightly. Bruised and beaten, the first changes began to roll out, from graphical reworks to the following year, 2017, starting off with what is likely the most impactful individual content release in the game's short history. The Chambers of Xeric, old school RuneScape's first raid. One that, for all its flaws, showed remarkable vision and understanding of what old school RuneScape is. It would be relatively easy to look toward World of Warcraft, the most popular MMO, and copy that format, the lockouts, mechanics, corridors, but that's not what Chambers is. Instead, it's a sprawling, multi-floor semi-roguelite where you must use many of the skills in RuneScape to solve puzzle rooms, brave mini-bosses, and eventually gear up to challenge the final boss, Great Olm, who to this day is considered one of the best and most iconic fights in the game. Much like how understanding skill intersectionality created these unique rooms and randomly generated layouts, their understanding of emergent mechanics formed the backbone to this boss fight's longevity, one that is still a core part of a player's account progression 8 years after its release. The Chambers of Xeric also released alongside an addition to the landmass, the Kebos Lowlands, which is actually not Kourend, it's a separate region, but it's connected, and again, just let me summarize. The Farming Guild came out, Mount Karul, not named that initially, and its respective Slayer dungeon and new quests that further gave context to this land's history and its place in the world. But they were just getting started. The visual issues still remained, and while the art style consistencies in old school RuneScape would be a video in and of themselves, it is interesting to see how this new and growing team harnessed their evolving understanding of old school RuneScape's graphics to essentially standardize them across 2 new regions. It's also worth noting that the team itself, over the years, expanded. More artists began to work on old school RuneScape, so fleshing out a territory became far more a reasonable request. We got landmass restructuring and graphical refreshes of multiple houses, Shazian and Hosidius, transforming them from barren monoliths to feeling more lived in and natural. With these refreshes, a host of new quests, spells, and navigational upgrades were added too, what could have been slowly turned into a reality. It didn't feel like an unfinished vestige hanging on the fleshed out main world, it felt like an aspect of the main world. The trust lost returned as well, and even increased over time. Intelligent players began to see that even in failing, the content wouldn't be left to rot. I can't overstate just how big of a risk Kourend was. The world of RuneScape is so tightly designed and navigationally driven that creating something as, well, flat as Kourend could have caused irreversible damage to the game. This, to me, was the greatest risk in the history of OSRS, and upon learning more about it, gave me newfound confidence in some of the later ventures that Jagex would take on. None more important than Varlamore, the second new landmass, which is also technically a part of Kourend and Kebos, but it was only fully connected after it was completed. It's a new region, okay? Environments are never completed, not in old school RuneScape. That's part of its beauty. Content is always added when inspired, and while Kourend surely feels better than it did on launch, I wouldn't be surprised to see 10 years down the line a dozen new quests, activities, bosses, and minigames to further flesh out its place. In fact, just this year we saw Yama inhabit the Hellish Chasm at its center. Varlamore, though, was kind of a do-over, a region that, using their pre-existing knowledge and their ever-growing understanding of content development, Jagex could create with confidence, assurance it would work right off the bat. There would be no need for years upon years of Varlamore refreshes to keep it up to snuff. A new 3-phase content cadence was established, with 3 parts of Varlamore releasing over the course of a year and a half. The first part brought with it the Colosseum, the main city it was connected to, and a savanna region with a pretty substantial expansion to the Hunter skill. From a game design standpoint, it's fascinating to see the growth present when comparing Varlamore's Part 1 release with the initial Kourend one. Obviously, they have a bigger, more active development team, but that's not the entire story, because while true, their entire team isn't relegated to a specific project. This is what a more established understanding of the game and its design, matched with what is likely to be a more thorough development pipeline, leads to. An aesthetically cohesive and relatively bug-free launch that brought with it a host of new content, without biting off more than what the team could chew. In fact, when split into segments, understanding the Varlamore release is pretty straightforward. Each one brings with it 1 or 2 new activities, maybe a minigame, 2 or 3 new PvM challenges, and a small expansion to a pre-existing skill. Alongside this, a main story quest that drives the base narrative forward, and multiple side quests that give flavor to different areas of this region. It's kind of like a demonstration of everything Jagex and its player base has envisioned old-school RuneScape to be after over a decade of consideration. If Jagex had to rebuild the entire game from scratch, it would likely operate something like Varlamore, because just about every lesson learned was implemented in some way to help Varlamore feel like a part of Gielinor. What I find to be especially interesting about it, though, is how it in some ways is a mirror to our mainland, systemically. It very subtly suggests that there are areas to improve on, and here's how. For example, the Colosseum is an iteration on the Fight Caves and Inferno. While it too has its issues such as the modifier system that felt a little too binary for some people's tastes, it also improved on what I imagine to be a lot of people's quit points for the Inferno. For one, it's shorter, much shorter, and the difficulty begins quicker, meaning that you don't have to spend 30-odd minutes slogging through nonsense boring waves just to reach the point you died to earlier. Also, it actually offers loot, not just for completing the entire thing, but for completing individual waves too. While this loot is lost if not claimed and the run forfeited, this gave Jagex the opportunity to add a host of new items to the endgame table. And of course, upon completion, you'd get a backslot item to show everyone just how much of a badass you really are. But there's more. My favorite example is actually Perilous Moons as a mirror to Barrows, one of the most legendary pieces of PvM content in the game. At one point, Barrows was endgame. Now it's essentially the first boss you can do. Barrows, for all of its iconic elements, from the awesome armor sets to set effects to its location in Mauritania, is also annoying as hell. From prayer drains to walking in circles, finding the right doors to fighting relatively boring bosses. It's also without many interesting mechanics in general. You can do some tech with Mage to avoid being hit, but other than that, there really isn't much depth here, and more importantly, for its position in the early game now, it doesn't teach much about PvM as it exists in old school RuneScape today. Now, I would argue it does teach valuable lessons, especially in how navigation and inventory management synergize with successful boss runs, and how to make sure your prayer doesn't run out while fighting Darok.
Okay. Ah!
Perilous Moons sought to be something more with this Barrow's Brother format, without devaluing them entirely. In fact, the designer of them did something pretty genius, create a new set of bosses that rely on you having incredibly tanky armor to survive. Tanky armor that is most reasonably obtained from Barrows. These two releases, almost 20 years apart, interlinked like missing puzzle pieces. Now, I may be biased because I did Perilous Moons at the perfect time in my account's lifespan, but it was inordinately satisfying going from getting a few tank pieces to using those pieces immediately in an effort to push slightly more difficult and rewarding content. Much like Barrows, Perilous Moons saw you venture deep underground and fight a collection of spirits, each dropping its respective armor and weapons that, when wielded together, offered transformative set effects. This armor is the opposite of Barrows, very squishy yet high in offensive and hybrid bonuses. The intermediary space it inhabits is awesome, and the effects given is the kind of creativity I wish more endgame gear had. But that's not all. Alongside the more engaging boss fights and generally more diverse and cool environment, you also sustain yourself. This could have been inspired by Chambers of Xeric actually, the ability to farm your own supplies, your own combat potions, food, and so on, through relatively novel methods of play, such as setting up little salamander traps being a pretty interesting method for Hunter, or the fishing that had you angle your net to catch things at an expedited rate. As the rollout for Varlamore continued, it wasn't without its missteps either. For example, in Part 2, the Huecoatl early to mid-game group boss was pretty underwhelming, not mechanically per se, but in its rewards, offering virtually nothing relevant until Jagex retroactively buffed rates and majorly changed its signature Dragon Hunter wand drop. The Mastering Mixology minigame was a focal point of scrutiny due to its imbalance, but after being fixed, I find it to be a relatively harmless, if a little flavorless addition. The quests were solid altogether and set up the grand finale well. The third part, the final part, released only a short while ago, and I can confidently say it is my favorite of the three, because while it still mirrors much of the main game, it also pushes the envelope if only a little bit. When it comes to mirrors, look no further than the finale quest granting you an early game scimitar weapon. I wonder what that's supposed to remind people of. But more interestingly was the new Delve boss that minorly redefines what an endgame encounter can look like. Its delving mechanic is pretty novel and takes liberally from our sister game, RuneScape 3, and their Enrage bosses, but tunes it more aptly around the OSRS economy. The new fletching activity made actual content out of a skill defined by clicking two items together in your inventory very fast, and the new Slayer mobs offer access to niche upgrades for early to mid-game accounts that actually has ranged strength bonus on it. Crazy. But why do I bring all of this up? What's the point? Just to glaze Jagex and say, hey look, they did it well this time? Not really. While I think Varlamore was pretty exceptional and now houses some of the best content in the game, there's something more curious at play. And that's because of sailing. I'm sure everyone is aware of this incoming skill and much of the discourse surrounding it, both critically valuable and occasionally uncritically silly. The issue is that sailing has become a hot-button topic in much the same way politics at a Thanksgiving dinner has, and fomenting productive conversations is borderline impossible. Don't ask your parents what they think of Israel-Palestine or whether they think shooting cannonballs should give combat experience. Those who hate it will do so regardless. It could usher in a triple platinum 500,000 concurrent player base golden age and pave the way to the new best raid ever, but skill bad sailing minigame, etc. But also, this small vocal subsection of very angry people are drowning out valuable criticism too. It's easy to look at the kind of outcry on Twitter and scoff, brushing it all away, but that's not healthy either. As I outlined in my polling video, this game has always been about communal iteration. The players curate content and the developers develop it. This synergy has, for better or for worse, become the blood that pumps through the beating heart of OSRS. And for as much as I may hate many of the sailing criticisms, such as it being like a minigame, but also there's loads of valid criticism too, such as movement needing work, the speed of the boats feeling sluggish, the methods of training not hitting flow states in the ways that some modern skilling activities do, and even the rewards may be not perfectly fitting thematically or otherwise. Jimmy made a video critiquing sailing and it did so quite well. It's all valuable and also only exists because of the last decade. Skills have failed polls constantly. Sailing was on the verge of doing so too. The good faith established by the OSRS developers and its players is responsible for the trust instilled in them to see something like this through. In fact, it's crucial. More than that, it's mandatory. There is no RuneScape without iteration and transformation. Live service MMOs don't work in a stasis. We can't release the same set of updates over and over again and expect the player numbers to increase. Right, Blizzard? All of the most transformative content always saw the most interest, from raids not representing anything from pre-2007 to the very nature of plugins. But even that's not entirely it. RuneScape has always been about skills. That is more core to the game than just about anything else. Without skills, we wouldn't have the sandbox intersectionality allowing for methods of play we love today. It's only in the way skills function does RuneScape find its identity, which is why I was so surprised to see skills persistently fail polls, but an entirely new landmass passing. A new land is very much not in the spirit of RuneScape if you think about it. In fact, it's so not in the spirit of RuneScape, the current landmass doesn't even have a name, yet a new one was added and look where it is now. Look how it is now. That was without precedent, without preceding successes and failures to take inspiration from. Meanwhile, for skills, RuneScape has been getting those for decades, sometimes yearly. There is so much to pull from, so much information to learn from, that while sailing is, yes, a lot broader and more wicked a task, it is undeniably one that already has existing content to use as inspiration. It's also transformative, maybe even evolutionary. That's scary. The E word has, as mentioned at the start of the video, haunted OSRS for years. Reasonably so. After all, without it, OSRS wouldn't exist. But also, it's been over a decade that trust has built, and I think we can extend that to the developers as they have, time and time again, shown an astute understanding of the game, and maybe even more importantly, the ability to react quickly and change accordingly. They aren't the corporate overlords pushing in monetization surveys or increasing membership prices or whatever else. They are the people iterating mechanically, systemically, things that function today better than they ever have, and that's seen by just how readily accessible and lovable the game is. It's not just a mainstay in the public conscious anymore, it's a pervasive competitor to the largest MMO in the world. Updates like Sailing, as frightening as they may be, are kind of crucial to establishing old-school RuneScape as more than what it is often conflated to be. My very first video, the first script I ever wrote for YouTube, was about nostalgia and old-school RuneScape, how nostalgia is a marketing tool, it is a foot in the door, but what keeps people playing is far more evocative and important. Nostalgia is the aesthetic, the music, the twin braziers of the launcher. It's not the endgame being barrows or the best item being the abyssal whip. That has been proven to fail, to kill the game. One of my goals with starting this YouTube channel was to destigmatize the word evolution, because while the evolution of combat was a total disaster, that doesn't mean that evolution is now a sin. It can be done well and poorly. As long as we have a vision and understanding of what makes the game great, then we won't ever lose that. There is no risk of accidentally changing the entire combat system. The last 5 or so videos I made all have been analyzing different parts of what makes old-school RuneScape feel like old-school RuneScape and how the systems behind that have changed, but the feelings have remained. The early to mid-game progression has been drastically evolved to having half a dozen different paths to go on, entirely new landmasses to explore, yet at no point does someone look at Kourend or even Varlamore and not see it as old-school RuneScape. At no point does someone look at Guardians of the Rift and see a different game. Why can't that extend to a new skill? After 10 years of persistent growth, of many mistakes, but even more fixes and additions and iterations and evolutions, isn't it reasonable to also expand on arguably the most fundamental part of the game, the most identifiably RuneScape element? Because while I think systemic evolution is fine if done well, a new skill doesn't really even do that either. It's iterative and expansive, but it doesn't evolve gameplay, it just evolves perception. My favorite example of this is actually from the recent WoW streamers playing OSRS for the first time. I of course relate to this being a semi-recent convert too, but one of the biggest surprises was in how many of them didn't actually know what old school RuneScape is. I don't mean that as a game, because most gamers know what old school RuneScape is visually, what the music may sound like, but so many of them didn't know that it was receiving updates. They genuinely thought that it was just a re-release of an old MMO that is still popular, which likely confused them because how? How did it get more popular after not receiving substantial updates, especially coming from classic WoW? Why do you think they thought this? My impression is that it's because old school RuneScape's updates have yet to break into the general MMO space. In fact, one of the first times I saw it do so wasn't with Varlamore or a new boss, but rather with a new skill, something everyone can immediately understand because skills in RuneScape are as ubiquitous and unique as the music. For as grindy as skills are, their value is almost ethereal. It's like the glue that holds the game together. And now that a new one is being added, and it's not just woodcutting 2 or combat with extra steps, or some power creep in the form of buffs, it's an entirely new explorable area that is supported by the method of exploration being the skill. I think that evokes a lot of interest from just feeling like an RPG. I'll stake my channel on this. I think more new players, those who've never played OSRS before, will check out Sailing than any other content update so far. That's not to say they'll become addicts or even play past level 30, but that the feeling a new skill evokes is unlike any other form of advertising, especially one like Sailing. Their interest isn't stemming from liking spreadsheets or clicking simulators, but from a sense of mystery and equal footing. They are just as new to this uncharted territory as everyone else, and for once, new territory isn't explicitly governed by only well-established systems. Skills have always been a part of RuneScape's identity, and if we value what RuneScape was, then we ought to recognize that it only was that way because of the kinds of innovations and additions that were most common, skills being one of them. The vibe that wants to be retained in keeping true to 2007 is one that was only made possible by the updates that preceded it. The version of RuneScape you remember most fondly isn't one that was stuck repeating the same thing over and over again. It was blazing trails and of course flew too close to the sun. Now, much like in 2013, much like with Kourend and Varlamore, there is the potential for a do-over, a second chance at something newer and better, not by scrapping something or destroying a pre-existing norm or system, but by expanding a definition and iterating on intent. Sailing is undeniably a huge undertaking, one that should be seen skeptically and should be criticized reasonably, but one that every single player should want to succeed. This is an opportunity to use the past decade of knowledge and growth not to cower away from risk, but to confidently surmount it. Think back to a time when you first started playing the game and the parts of it that drew you in most. The most curious mysteries, the most aspirational achievements. Whether you started playing 2 decades or 2 months ago, I think the identity of this game is so clear. It's not maxing an account or doing the hardest raid, it's something more foundational, a demonstration of why we all still aggregate around an old point-and-click adventure game. After all, there is nothing more old school, nothing more RuneScape than looking at the horizon and saying, I wonder what's over there.